ever get the feeling that your economic success isn't uh, entirely in your control? Like maybe the rules of the game in your country play a bigger role than we realize.
I think a lot of people feel that way, yeah.
Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today. Different types of capitalism, how they work, how they impact people's lives.
And how they stack up against each other.
Exactly. You sent over a Harvard Business School case study on this, plus some really detailed data on economic and social indicators. So our mission,
To break it all down,
yep, to help you really understand these different systems inside and out.
it can be pretty dense stuff, lots of jargon.
Definitely. So whether you're prepping for a meeting on global economics, or maybe even thinking about moving abroad.
Or hey, even if you just want to sound super smart at your next dinner party,
Exactly.
this deep dive is for you. Let's kick things off with a classic debate. Does capitalism ultimately help or hurt people?
The million-dollar question. And there's no easy answer. On the one hand, capitalism has undeniably lifted millions out of poverty. That's undeniable. Right.
But at the same time, you have critics like Naomi Klein who argue that it concentrates wealth in the hands of a few, that it worsens inequality.
So how do we make sense of these seemingly contradictory outcomes? I mean, on the surface, they seem to clash, right?
Well, the economists who wrote this case study, Esmaglu and Robinson, offer a really compelling framework.
Right, lay it on me.
They focus on the role of institutions, the rules, the norms, the organizations that shape how a society behaves.
Okay.
They argue that inclusive institutions, the ones that promote broad participation and a level playing field, those tend to lead to better outcomes overall.
Inclusive institutions, got it.
Yeah.
So then the opposite would be what?
Well, they call extractive institutions.
Okay, so inclusive versus extractive.
Right. And with extractive institutions, power and wealth get concentrated among a small elite, often at the expense of the broader population.
So think countries with high corruption.
Yeah, exactly. Or places where political power is tightly controlled.
Okay, so far it seems pretty straightforward. Inclusive good, extractive bad. But wait, now I'm remembering something from the case study about Singapore. They mentioned it as the kind of a hybrid, right?
You've got a good memory. Yeah, they said it's economically inclusive, but politically extractive.
Right. So it's not always so black and white.
Exactly. And that's why this framework is so valuable. It helps us see the nuance. Singapore's economic success, despite its limited political freedoms, suggests there are multiple pathways. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing.
Interesting. So I'm thinking, does a country's level of inclusiveness or extractiveness actually impact economic growth? Like, can we see that in the numbers?
That is the question, isn't it? And the case study does offer some pretty fascinating insights. While inclusive systems tend to have higher GDP per capita overall.
Okay, higher overall wealth.
Right, but that doesn't necessarily mean they grow faster year over year.
Oh, interesting. So could an extractive system actually outperform an inclusive one, at least for a while?
Absolutely, and they use China as a prime example. They've experienced incredible growth, but...
But there's got to be a but here.
Well, the catch is extractive systems often hit a ceiling. They might be good at mobilizing resources or exploiting cheap labor, but they tend to struggle with innovation. That's where they fall short.
Makes sense. If a small group controls all the power and wealth, they're not exactly incentivized to change things up, right?
Exactly. They're more likely to protect their own interests, even if it means stifling progress. And that's where inclusive systems shine. They're more dynamic, more adaptable.
This reminds me of something from the case study, something about creative destruction. They said it's key for innovation. Can you remind me what that means?
Oh, sure. Creative destruction. That's an idea from economist Donny Roderick. He argues that real economic progress comes from challenging the status quo, like constantly disrupting things.
Okay, but how does that actually play out? Can you give me a concrete example?
Think of Silicon Valley. Startups trying to disrupt big established companies.
Yeah.
That constant competition, it forces everyone to innovate. You either adapt or you die, basically.
It's like survival of the fittest, but for businesses.
That's a great way to put it. And that kind of dynamic just isn't present in an extractive system.
Interesting. So inclusive systems might not always be the fastest, but they're in it for the long haul.
Yeah, I like that analogy. They're like marathon runners. They might start slow, but they have the stamina to go the distance. And to really illustrate this point, the case study uses a pretty powerful example, the Soviet Union.
Ah, the Soviet Union. I have a feeling this isn't a success story.
Not exactly. In the beginning, they saw rapid growth, industrialization, all under their centralized extractive model.
Okay.
But over time, that lack of creative destruction caught up with them, innovation stagnated, the economy sputtered, and eventually the whole system collapsed.
Wow. So they basically put all their eggs in one basket, and then that basket went bad.
Yeah, you could say that. They prioritized control over innovation, and it ultimately backfired.
It's a cautionary tale for sure. Okay, so we've talked about capitalism as this broad concept, and we've seen how inclusive systems seem to have an edge over extractive ones, at least in the long run. But I know this case study goes even deeper, introducing this whole idea of varieties of capitalism, right?
You're right. It turns out that even among systems we consider inclusive, there's still a lot of variation.
So it's not just about being inclusive or extractive. There are different flavors of inclusiveness.
Exactly, it's not a binary. And that's where the work of two other economists, Hall and Soskis, comes in. They developed something called the Varieties of Capitalism model, or VOCI for short.
Okay, VOCI, I'm intrigued. What are the key differences? How do these varieties actually play out in the real world?
Well, they argue that there are two main types of advanced capitalist systems: liberal market economies,
LMEs?
yep, and coordinated market economies.
CMEs.
Right, LMEs and CMEs.
Okay, I'm following. LMEs and CMEs. But what actually sets them apart?
The VOCI model focuses on several key areas, things like employee relations, vocational training, how companies get financed, even how they compete.
So it's about the nitty-gritty details of how businesses operate within the system.
Precisely. And to illustrate this, they offer two prime examples. The US, representing the LME model,
Okay,
and Germany as a classic example of a CME.
interesting. All right, so break it down for me. What's the defining characteristic of an LME like the U.S.?
In an LME, it's all about free markets, competition, and what they call arm's length transactions. Basically, individuals and companies are left to their own devices. Minimal government intervention.
So it's a sink or swim approach.
Pretty much. The idea is that competition drives innovation and efficiency.
Okay, got it. And what about CMEs like Germany? What makes them different?
CMEs are all about collaboration. Coordination between businesses, labor unions, the government. They put a big emphasis on long-term stability, employee training, and a more equitable distribution of wealth.
So if LMEs are all about competition, CMEs are about cooperation.
You got it. But it's important to note, the case study emphasizes that neither system is inherently better. They each have their own strengths and weaknesses.
Right, right. It's all about trade-offs.
Yeah.
LMEs might be better at generating quick growth, but CMEs may offer a higher quality of life.
Exactly. And there are even more nuances within these categories. It's not a rigid binary. But before we get too lost in the weeds, maybe it's helpful to look at some real-world data.
Yeah, let's bring in those data exhibits we have. See what the numbers actually tell us about these different flavors of capitalism.
Let's do it.
Okay, so we've got all this data, tons of economic and social indicators. Where should we start? What's a good entry point?
Well, Exhibit 4 is a good place to start, I think. It's got all the economic data, and I think it would be interesting to compare the U.S. and Germany.
Oh yeah, that's a good idea. Since they represent those two varieties of capitalism, the LME and CME, right?
Exactly.
Right.
So what do you notice right away?
Well, the U.S. has a much higher GDP per capita. That's pretty striking.
Right. It kind of reinforces the idea that LMEs, with all that emphasis on free markets and competition, they can really generate some serious wealth.
Yeah, that makes sense. But there's got to be a downside, right? I mean, you can't just have all the benefits with no drawbacks.
You're absolutely right. There are always trade-offs. If you look at the Giannini coefficient, which measures income inequality, the U.S. has a way higher score than Germany.
Ah, so that's the catch. Higher overall wealth, but it's not distributed as evenly.
Exactly. And this plays out in the social indicators, too. It's not just about the raw numbers.
Let's see. What about Exhibit 5, the one with the social data? Anything interesting there?
Yeah, definitely. One thing that jumps out is social mobility. Way higher in Germany.
So you're more likely to climb the economic ladder in Germany than in the U.S.
Exactly. Even if you're born into a less privileged family, you've got a better shot at achieving economic success.
Okay, that's a big difference. So this is what inclusive institutions are all about.
Right. Creating opportunities for everyone, regardless of background. Leveling the playing field, so to speak.
This is making a lot of sense now. But what about those Scandinavian countries? Denmark, Sweden, they always top those happiest countries lists. What's their secret?
Take a look at Exhibit 6. It focuses on happiness and well-being. You'll notice Denmark and Sweden, even though they have a lower GDP per capita than the U.S., their citizens report way higher levels of happiness.
Interesting. It's like money can't buy happiness,
Mhm.
or at least not as much happiness as a good social safety net, strong communities.
Yeah. It's about more than just money. And if you look at the data on work-life balance, social support, those Scandinavian countries, they really put their citizens first, maybe even over economic growth.
Seems to be working for them.
Okay.
Okay, so we've talked about LMEs like the US,
Yeah.
CMEs like Germany, even those happy socialist Scandinavian models. But we haven't talked about China. They're kind of their own thing, right?
Oh, absolutely. The case study calls their system state capitalism, and yeah, it's really unique.
Remind me again, what makes China's system so different?
Well, the level of government involvement is really the key difference. In China, the government doesn't just regulate the economy, they participate in it. They own huge chunks of companies, control key resources, direct investment too.
So it's a mix of capitalism and central planning.
You could say that. And they mentioned some pretty big examples in the case study, state-owned enterprises, like China Mobile, one of the biggest mobile phone companies in the world.
Right, right. And the major Chinese banks, too.
Exactly. That level of government involvement, it's pretty rare in Western economies.
Yeah. But does the state-driven approach have any advantages compared to the LME or CME model?
Well, it can really speed up economic development. I mean, look at China's growth. Being able to direct investment like that, to mobilize resources so quickly, it's pretty powerful.
Yeah, it's like capitalism on steroids, at least in terms of growth.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but there are trade-offs. State capitalism, a lot of people criticize it for stifling innovation, limiting competition.
Yeah, I could see that. If the government's making all the calls, why would anyone take risks?
Right. And it makes you wonder about the long-term sustainability of that model. Can they keep growing at that pace if they don't encourage more organic innovation?
It's like they built this incredible engine, but they're still figuring out how to fuel it.
That's a great way to put it. And if you look closely at the data, some of these exhibits, you can start to see that tension playing out.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Which exhibits, what kind of hints are we talking about here?
Well, take a look at Exhibit 10. It tracks patents filed per capita. And China, they still lag behind countries like the US, Japan, Germany, even with their rapid growth.
Hmm. Interesting. So they're good at adapting existing technologies, but not necessarily creating new ones.
That's a good way to summarize it. And it goes back to a point the case study makes about how sustainable growth isn't just about producing stuff, it's about fostering a culture of creativity and risk-taking.
Right, right. So China's model, it might be good for a while, but can it adapt to a changing world? Can they address those concerns about innovation, about inequality?
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting. The case study, it suggests that these systems, they're not static, they evolve. They adapt to pressures.
So even though we've been talking about these models as separate things, in reality, the lines are kind of blurry.
Yeah, think of it less like separate boxes and more like points on a spectrum, and countries can move along that spectrum.
Oh, okay. So a country could start as an LME and shift toward a more CME approach over time.
Absolutely. It happens all the time. And there are all kinds of factors that can drive those changes. Technology, global power shifts, even just evolving social values.
Wow. It's like we're all part of this giant economic experiment, and nobody knows how it's going to end.
That's a great way to think about it. And it brings us to one of the big questions of our time. I mean, we're talking about capitalism as this global force.
Okay, what's the big question?
Can these different models of capitalism coexist peacefully? I mean, in a world where capital flows across borders so easily.
Wow, that's a big one. I don't know the answer.
Me neither. But it's a question we need to be asking, right?
Yeah.
It has huge implications, not just for businesses and investors, but for global stability, cooperation, all of it.
Yeah, you're right. Big stuff. Well, on that note, I think it's time to start wrapping things up. But before we do, I'd like to leave our listeners with something to think about. Somebody to keep the conversation going.
I like it. What do you have in mind?
So we've been talking about capitalism on this global scale. But what about the individual? How does the type of capitalism in your country actually impact your daily life, your opportunities, your sense of well-being?
That's a great question. It's something we all need to reflect on. After all, economics, it's not just some abstract theory. It's about people and the choices we make as individuals and as a society.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder the complexities of capitalism. We'll be back next time for another deep dive. It really makes you think, how these huge systems we're talking about, they actually come down to the choices we make every day.
It's true. Every job we take, every product we buy, even every vote we cast, It all feeds back into the system.
And shapes the direction of that system, for better or worse.
Exactly. It's a lot of responsibility when you think about it.
Yeah, no kidding. It's both kind of exciting and a little terrifying at the same time, isn't it?
Definitely. But that's why studying comparative capitalism is so important, I think. It helps us understand these complex systems so we can make, more informed choices
Yeah.
about the world we want to live in.
So it's not just about the theory, it's about using that knowledge to actually make a difference.
Exactly. That's why I'm always excited to do these deep dives. It's a chance to really dig into these important topics and hopefully, get people thinking, maybe even inspire them to do something.
Well said. This has been a great deep dive, one of the most thought-provoking we've done. I mean, we've covered so much. The basics of capitalism, the differences between LMEs and CMEs, even China's state capitalism model. But as always, I like to leave our listeners with something to chew on, a question to spark further exploration.
I'm ready. Hit me with it.
Okay, so we've been talking about capitalism as this global system, but what about the role of culture? Like, how does a country's history, its traditions, its values, how do those things shape its particular brand of capitalism?
Ooh, that's a good one. That makes me think about Germany, for example. They have a very strong emphasis on social welfare, collaborative decision making. Is that just, a result of their economic system, or is it something deeper, maybe rooted in the cultural values,
Yeah.
community, solidarity, things like that?
Right. Or Japan, they have that whole
Mhm.
thing about lifetime employment, group harmony. And those cultural values, they seem to really influence their approach to business.
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely adds another layer of complexity to the whole thing. And it suggests that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's not just about copying what works somewhere else. It's about finding what works for your specific culture, your values.
Yeah. And maybe that's the biggest takeaway from all of this.
Yeah.
There's no single right answer when it comes to capitalism. The best system is the one that reflects a society's values, its history, its goals for the future.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's a good reminder that economics, it's not just about numbers, it's about people and the kind of world we want to build together.
Absolutely. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap things up. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of comparative capitalism. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration.